This is the Belle Books and Stories podcast with your host, Richard Dykstra. Welcome, you're listening to Belle Media Podcast, where we take a look at some great books and the stories behind the books. In this episode, I'm speaking to politician, writer and campaigner Peter Hain. Brought up in South Africa by anti-apartheid activist parents, the family were eventually forced to move to London when he was 16 after continual harassment by the South African security forces. Peter first came to prominence as chair of the Stop the 70s tour. The apartheid-era South Africa regime took great pride from the perceived sporting successes of their whites-only sports teams, and he placed great importance on their sporting links with the outside world. Stop the Tour challenged this. The movement mobilised opposition that severely disrupted the South African rugby tour in the autumn of 1969 and finally forced the last-minute cancellation of the South African cricket tour of England the following summer, much to the fury of the South African government and most of the white minority population. It also partly paved the way for the further sporting isolation of South Africa with bans from the Olympics and the FIFA World Cup. Peter was then a leading young Liberal, but he then switched to Labour in 1977. A passionate and committed politician, he's also someone who understands the opportunities, realities, and limitations of power. He was first elected to the Commons as the MP for Neath in 1991 and served as a cabinet minister in a variety of roles under both Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. He stood down from being an MP in the 2015 general election after representing his constituents for 25 years and was appointed to the Lords the same year. As well as a politician, he's also a prolific author. I'm delighted to welcome Peter Hain.
Thank you.
Peter, your latest book, The Rhino Conspiracy, is mainly set in contemporary South Africa. Perhaps you could tell us a bit about it?
Well, it's a combination of story about poaching and the outrageous poaching of rhinos in particular for their horns, which are then transported normally to East Asia, especially to Vietnam and China and surrounding countries, and used, ground down often into powder, and used for all sorts of, in my view, obscene things like aphrodisiacs, allegedly, drugs as a cocaine substitute, and a lot of money is paid for by the elites in these countries. And actually, at the end of it is the threat to the rhino as a species, because they have been poached and killed on a prodigious, almost industrial scale, like elephants. So that's the heart of the story. But behind this poaching are not just bad local poachers. They're often poor Africans who are used as and manipulated by organized crime, international syndicates, behind which often sit corrupt politicians and indeed government officials and ministers and members of parliament. So my book, set in contemporary South Africa, especially under the era of President Zuma, who was in power for 7 years and introduced massive corruption and cronyism, is a combination of the wildlife side of it, the horror of poaching and what it does to wild animals. These, in the case of rhinos, these regal animals that are chomping away on their grass and leaves in perfect symphony with the world, and then suddenly they're blown apart by a poacher's rifle or AK-47. But behind that is this organized international network of crime, and it's that fusion of the two that this thriller, and it is a thriller, tells a story of people trying to combat it, both from both the wildlife end and also the political activist end as well.
I'm interested in the fact that you chose to write it as a thriller, because clearly, obviously, as a politician, you've written a lot of political books, but in this situation, you're weaving the two together. Was there a particular reason why you chose it like that?
Well, I read a lot of thrillers. I'm sports mad, so I often used to raise eyebrows when we gathered before cabinet meetings in 10 Downing Street by reading the sports pages of the newspapers before the news pages. And I thought, well, I'd like to try my hand at writing a thriller. I'd written, as you say, over 20 non-fiction books about various current affairs and politics issues, and a biography published a few years ago on his centenary of Nelson Mandela, a short readable biography. But I wanted to try my hand at writing a thriller and to try and make it pacey, and I hope you found it so, Richard, that draws the reader in and takes you on this journey.
I think it definitely does that. I think it's interesting too, the mix between the political position in South Africa at the moment, some of the back history that comes through, and then also the whole issue to do with wildlife. I mean, again, I'm interested. You say that you wanted to write a thriller, but you focused there on rhino poaching. But as I say, there's a lot of other issues to do with politics and all that kind of stuff. So, what came first? Was it the idea of doing it on poaching, or was it the idea of doing it in contemporary South Africa?
Well, they kind of merged together in my mind because, on the one hand, you had my wife and I's love of wildlife, and we'd been to this extraordinary jewel of a safari park called Tula Tula in KwaZulu Natal, inland and north of Durban, and we loved it so much. And there's an interesting backstory to that. I don't know if you, as a wildlife conservationist yourself, Richard, whether you've ever read Lawrence Anthony's The Elephant Whisperer, which is a terrific story about his relationship with what started off as a rogue elephant herd
Mm,
and how he got to know them better and basically settle them down. And it's about the Tula Tula Game Reserve. It's a gripping story. It's not fiction. It's about a factual account of his experience.
yeah.
And it was visiting that and really understanding that story much better and loving wildlife as I do, and then being horrified by what I saw under President Zuma's 10 years of rule, of the betrayal of the Nelson Mandela legacy, his legacy of freedom and justice and integrity, above all, integrity and morality and equal opportunities for all. And that marvelous symbol of great leadership, from which the world is badly lacking from at the moment, I might say,
Yes.
that Nelson Mandela gave and became an iconic figure, probably the most worshipped political figure of our era, our generation. And to see that being betrayed by corrupt ministers and the corrupt president and it infecting the whole of the system on the one hand,
Mm,
and then trying to understand why rhino poaching was happening. I mean, I've just seen the news from the Congo that there's a poacher who killed, I think, 500 elephants, and he's just been given an extensive jail sentence. And that's very unusual.
mm.
It's very unusual for these poacher kings to actually be caught and jailed. And so that was the idea of bringing those two together that began to form in my mind.
Interesting that in a way you were also inspired by hearing about the work of people who have then dedicated their lives to conservation. I mean, I think one of the things which is very inspiring in my life was actually meeting a guy called Ted Riley, who is the father of conservation in Swaziland, or now Eswatini is now, and hearing his story and also being with him and just seeing how dedicated he is to his animals, that he would do anything to try to protect them, but also realizing how he was having to battle corruption and all the issues that were going on there as well. So the story really resonated with me
Mm.
on that, I must say.
Mm. Oh, that's encouraging. And actually, as you'll know, having read the book, there are two characters, two wildlife rangers in the fictional game reserve called Zama Zama, uh, which means keep trying, keep striving,
Yeah,
translated from the Zulu language. And they are dedicated, particularly one of the key figures, the characters that I talk about, is based on a couple of rangers that I actually met. His name in the book is Isaac Mkhize, and he is dedicated to wildlife preservation and absolutely determined to do whatever it takes to protect the precious wildlife that he's dedicated his life and his career
yeah.
to working with and protecting.
Well, when I was staying with Ted, there were a lot of issues going on while we were there, and we didn't quite understand exactly what was going on, but it was all related into an incident about a year before where there had been a shootout when they were trying to protect the animals, and people had got killed, and there was all sorts of issues around that, and it really brought home to you the fact that it's a battle that's going on in some of these places. It may look like a nice tourist destination, but there's a lot of issues around.
Yes, I mean, I have Nkisi saying it's a war zone. This is a fight to the death. It's a fight to the death on the one hand for the species themselves.
Yeah,
I mean, elephants and rhinos are being shot on an industrial scale, but it is also a battle for life by the rangers
yeah,
who are being killed, uh, and the poachers themselves are often killed because, as I said, they're poor Africans, often from the locality, who the hard end of a long chain that reaches right the way to Hanoi in Vietnam or Beijing in China.
I suppose we shouldn't be completely pessimistic about all of this. I mean, one of the other things and why I've been involved to some extent in this is actually seeing that the way that tourism, well organized, has actually been able to bring a sort of an economic basis into that wildlife conservation, which over the years I think has actually achieved quite a lot of success. There's obviously, I have to say, I've also seen some terrible examples where people who really shouldn't have been involved had got involved because they saw it as a quick way of making money, whereas it's something that you have to be dedicated to, and that the tourist revenues really help your work rather than actually making you rich in terms of running a tourist experience.
Yes, I mean I completely agree. And the rangers themselves and the owners very rarely make money. They normally, the owners are lucky to turn in a small profit for the most part.
Yeah.
But they do it because that's their lives. I mean, I try to convey this in the book, and you'll have seen it at first hand yourself as a much greater knowledge than me. But it is that sheer dedication and passion. Their passion for wildlife is also something that we are a terribly destructive. We're the most destructive species in the history of the world, in the history of the planet, is humankind. And, we have to take responsibility for this. And I suppose, coming to this from a 50 years in politics and trying then to weave the story and understand better, and I don't consider myself an expert conservationist as you are in any way, or somebody like Lawrence Anthony, the late Lawrence Anthony was, or these rangers that I described. There's a fantastic book that I drew upon in my research by Julian Radomir called Killing for Profit. I'm not sure if you've come across it, but it is a really disturbing account and a definitive account of how this attempt to wipe out species just to make money.
One of the things I was going to say, that I think that your description of being in the wildlife reserves, I really liked that. There was very evocative of the experience, but also when you talk about what's actually happening during the instance of poaching, I mean, it's quite gruesome. Your descriptions there as well. So I think you really bring in the kind of two sides of that. The other thing I thought I would also talk about, though, is that clearly one of the things which really comes through in the book is your deep love of South Africa, and as you're talking about the legacy of Nelson Mandela. One of your key characters is a young activist who used the term, so it was born free, but also what you're suggesting within her character and how she's reacting to the veteran from the struggle is that there is a lack of knowledge in that generation about the struggles of the past, and your book, I think, starts to bring forward some of that history, which I thought was interesting. Would you like to talk a little more about that?
Yes, with pleasure. The character you're talking about, the young woman, black woman, Tandi Majeka, is a very independent young woman, very different from her peers who are more into their smartphones and worshipping celebrity and so on. And she's passionate about what's happening to her country. And I based her, I mean, she's an entirely fictional character, but I have her as the granddaughter of a maid that we became very, very close and friendly with as a white South African family when I was growing up, called Eva Majeka. And she was our maid in Pretoria. And when I say maid, most white families had maids, African women who cleaned and cooked very often and sometimes looked after young children as well. And most did not form the close bond of friendship and equality that Eva did with my parents because of their anti-apartheid activism. So Tundi, who I describe as a born free, because she was born, it's a term given to those born after apartheid had been ended and Nelson Mandela had come to power in 1994, and there's a lot of them, they account for getting on for half of the population, is somebody who understands her history because I've had her talking to her grandmother. And some of the experiences that she heard are actually experiences that our family, that my parents went through and that I observed as their son, and I'm proud to be their son, and some of the other characters as well. But I hope Tundi conveys a rather feisty, independent young woman who is determined to try and rescue the Mandela legacy and restore some of the values that he epitomized. And her relationship with the character I call the veteran, who is based on somebody real again, but was a freedom fighter in exile, and a lot of the experiences that he talks about and the wisdom that he conveys to her and the advice he gives her, because he recruits her as a protege. He needs somebody younger and more energetic. He's getting old and a little out of breath and lacking the kind of his former ability to keep driving on. And I hope their relationship, purely, by the way, I should say proper platonic relationship, but based on her learning from him and him encouraging her, and her sort of being independently minded and a bit impulsive, and he's saying, trying to rein her in and steady her down, and in a way that ultimately proves successful for what their cause is.
You're not supposed to say that yet, are you really? Give that away. One of the things, though, that I was also interested in was that there's a bit of the book where you reference the London recruits.
Yes.
And as it happens, I actually know one of the recruits,
Uh-huh.
a guy called Tom Belle.
Yeah.
And I was at the launch of their book a few years ago when they talked about their experiences, their secret exploits eventually becoming known. Perhaps you'd like to talk a little bit about the role in real life, because I think it's an interesting issue anyway, but also why you felt that it was a good idea to include them in the story.
Well, the veteran, and I have him having recruited the London recruits, young activists on the left of British politics, very much on the left of British politics, involved in the anti-apartheid struggle.
This would be in the 1960s.
This would have been the late 1960s and early 1970s, through the 1970s. And they were people who took a lot of risks. They went to South Africa as normal tourists, visitors, but they had suitcases of leaflets that exploded, showering leaflets of resistance to apartheid, what I regard as the most evil system of racism ever in the history of the world. It penetrated in every aspect of every life, from sport, as you mentioned before, right the way through to preventing marriage and dividing people into the schools they could and couldn't go to according to the color of their skin and accident of birth. And those young activists from London, mostly, who came to be known as the London recruits, I knew nothing about them, by the way, and nor did anybody else. It was kept a secret until pretty well the time of the publication of the book.
One of the things, as I understand it, was that their sort of activism was at a time when the ANC and other movements had effectively been almost totally suppressed.
Yes.
And there was nothing going on as far as the population was concerned. That, apartheid regime had actually got complete control.
Exactly. This was a time when Nelson Mandela and his leadership comrades had been dispatched to Robben Island, in his case, serving the first 10 years of his 27 years in prison, along with his Walter Sisulu and Governor Mbeki and Ahmed Kathrada, Nangru Mangeni, and others. And the veteran recruited these London recruits. And I mention them because one of the things he had to be very, very careful about was that they were people he could trust, because the security forces of South Africa, with the help of the British security forces and the right-wing activists in Britain, had infiltrated the anti-apartheid movement. And he had to be sure that these people could be trusted to be sent on these secret missions into South Africa, which they did with great bravery, risking arrest, possible death. And he sort of uses some of those techniques to test Tundi out when she first meets him and offers to help, to just check that she's genuine. She wasn't some kind of informer, because he was already outspokenly critical of the corruption of the regime. So that period was very important for that sort of activism, as it was for the campaign that I found myself leading, as you mentioned, to stop the 70 cricket tour, of direct action, pitch invasions and laying siege, non-violent direct action to physically disrupt the matches, because the international campaign became the focus. With the internal resistance to apartheid closed down, the international campaign became important, whether that was grannies refusing to buy South African oranges, or whether it was the London recruits, or the direct action campaign of the Stop the Tour movement, or the anti-apartheid movement, the most successful of all the international movements, the British anti-apartheid movement. Those campaigns were very critical in keeping the flame of freedom alight. And indeed, Nelson Mandela told me when I first met him after he came out of prison, and I met him in 1991 in Parliament, and he told me that actually the news of our Stop the Tour protests had penetrated through into his Robben Island cell, because his warders were fanatical Springbok rugby fans,
Yes,
and
right.
took it out, their vengeance on him, not realizing, because he knew nothing about this, there was a news blackout at that time.
So I now have to have my sort of moment of truth and reconciliation to say that I was actually at the Scotland South Africa game as a 13-year-old.
Richard.
I had been I had been taken there, so I might have seen you in action.
I'll acquit you as a 13-year-old.
I was debating whether I should mention it or not.
Why not? A lot of people were just like you at that age, just rugby fans. They didn't understand what we were doing. But, why we were doing what we were doing was because racist politics infected every nook and cranny of sport. You
Yeah.
couldn't play if you were the wrong color.
Yes, and I mean, I think that one of the things which is also an issue with all these things is that people's focus on what's happening internationally is quite narrow. So, it was also something that started to draw attention to things that they didn't really pay any attention to normally at all. So
Yes.
I can see the whole
And
issue of that.
people see sport in a sort of hermetically sealed world of its own. We've recently had the Black Lives Matter uh, issue, a very important issue for our age, surfacing within sport, as especially black sports footballers, like, for example, Raheem Sterling, have spoken out. Marcus Rashford and others have spoken out in a way that they didn't before. Maybe only Megan Rapinoe, the captain of the American women's football team, has been as outspoken. So I think it was very difficult for sports fans to understand, and they hated us, what we were doing in Britain, as well as they hated me for what we were doing among white South Africans hated me.
Actually, there's one bit of the book that you mentioned, and I just have to ask you again on that because it's just as a small incident. But is that correct that in the cricket tour that you had the team super glued into their rooms?
Yes, it was actually the Springbok rugby tour
Oh, it was the rugby
in the
tour. Okay,
Park
right.
Lane Hotel before the match against England in December 1969, and we booked a vivacious young woman activist into the hotel. She made friends with the Springboks and then discovered where they were all billeted, the rooms that they were in, and went round in the early hours of the morning injecting solidifying agent into their door locks so that they couldn't get out of their doors without breaking them down to come down for breakfast to
Right.
prepare for the match, which they lost. Maybe because of that against England.
Yeah.
And then somebody else hijacked their coach and drove it off and crashed it with half of the team inside. So by the time they arrived at the match, they were not well prepared.
The book comes through. There's a kind of your admiration for Nelson Mandela that you've mentioned before. Guiding South Africa through what could have been a period of great strife and things. But clearly, also, a lot of the book is directed to the fact of this legacy that you think has actually been, I don't know, subverted, I suppose. So, is there a view that what you're saying here is generally understood and that things are being done to change things there?
Well, President Zuma's rule was particularly poisonous for that decade of power before he was ousted by a new president for the last 2 years or so, President Cyril Ramaphosa, who is in the Nelson Mandela tradition, shares his values, and indeed was his preferred successor, Mandela's preferred successor. So he's been trying to tackle this corruption, but it is, corruption, when it gets into any system of politics, and there's lots of countries in Europe, Russia, Asia, not just throughout Africa, that have been deeply corrupted. But it's like a cancer, and I kind of try to convey this in the book. It's very difficult to deal with it once it's set into the body, in this case, the body politic and the body government. And almost what's worse about it is, as I think comes through in the book, is that cronyism, appointing all your friends, regardless of whether they're capable.
Mm.
In one case, Zuma appointed as the chair of the South African Airways, a former deputy head teacher who'd borne one of his many children, one of his many lovers. She had no experience of running airways, and it's not surprising that it was soon bankrupt. So, yeah, I think the political corruption, which then comes full circle back into being behind the wildlife, the threat to wildlife, and whole species like rhinos, is it's a circle.
One of the parts of the book that I thought was interesting, just as again the kind of detail that you go into, which helps explain a lot of what's happened to the various characters and how things have developed in South Africa, is the senior judge then flashing back to his childhood when he's been charged with subversion, because I think at the age of 10 or whatever he'd been involved in a demonstration, and how there is one single white woman in the court who seems to be trying to offer some support. And that would seem to be an interesting little touch that you've added there, and I just wondered if there was a reason for that.
There was, because it was my mother in real life, Adelaide Hain, and there was this 15-year-old boy in short pants, black youngster, who'd been on a protest against apartheid with his fellow activists and had not done anything violent, and found himself in court and dispatched to Robben Island for 10 years. So that is based on a real figure, and that story is true. There are a number of other parts, in fact, quite a lot of the characters are based on true characters. I'll make it clear they are fictional, but the stories are based on truth, and that's another reason why I think that the thriller format is a better way to tell. I hope you agree, to tell a story of real life, but in terms that can engage and that readers can find the pages being turned in front of them as they follow the story through.
Yes, I mean, I would say that the book is really doing three or four different things at the same time. That it is to do with the whole issues to do with conservation and poaching. It's a thriller, political primer, and also it's a historic account of what is actually one of the seminal parts of the history of the last century, really, as well. So we've talked a lot about rhinos and how they're threatened and what's happening in Africa. But of course, I know that you've also traveled extensively, partly obviously when you were foreign minister. And I know that, for instance, you've seen tigers in the wild. And I just thought that it would be interesting to see if you had any views of how things are different in the two countries, and just generally what your experience was when you were in India.
I had an absolutely amazing experience and such a privilege of witnessing a tigress in full flower coming out of the bushes from a pool where she'd been drinking and drank regularly, having tracked her with some professional trackers in Ranthambore, and seeing her coming out of the bushes and walking right past me. And I've got a beautiful, majestic photo of her. I could almost have patted her on the back from the cruiser, the Land Cruiser that we were on the back of. I don't think that had been very wise, Richard, but if she was so close and
Yes.
just uninterested in us, as wildlife is, if you're in a Land Cruiser, if you'd been on the ground, then you'd have been a threat.
Hmm.
But that just brought home to me in a different way, in an entirely different country when I was foreign minister, and I took a day out from normally packed visits a day in advance. I treated myself to an invitation to go up to Ranthambore on an Indian train, about 5-6 hours journey, and then back to Delhi afterwards. And it was a magical experience, and just made me realize that wildlife is threatened as tigers are,
Hmm.
not just on the African continent where the biggest prevalence of them is, but in Asia as well.
Well, I have to say, I envy you that you're sort of one day going to a tiger park and you got a sighting like that. I have to say that I was in 5 separate parks over an extended period before I finally saw a tiger. By that time, it was dusk, and the photograph I have is one that is not particularly well, actually, the photograph I have is one that I use when I go around schools talking to children about my own books, because they are linked into conservation as well. But I try to show them that actually this tiger, that sighting inspired me to write the books, because, as you said, it's a magical experience. And I think one of the things which is interesting in all of this is that when people get to see wildlife in the wild, they really do connect in a different way than they probably possibly could have imagined.
I completely agree. I was very lucky. I had the top trackers and rangers of Ranthambore look after me as a visiting foreign minister, and very keen to find this tiger for me. And we slept in tents just outside the park the night before and had a barbecue. And then early in the morning, I think we went in at about 5 o'clock, and we tracked them. We were driving around for a good couple of hours, and finally they spotted puck marks, the tiger's paws in a track, and then followed it. And they knew about the drinking pool and that might be where she was. And indeed, we drove right up and then looked down and saw her drinking, and then we raced back down in a frenzy to try and find her walking out of the bush, and we're just very lucky to do so. And it did, along with other safari experiences that I had in South Africa and indeed in Kenya, reinforced my desire to make a success of this book, The Rhino Conspiracy.
The other thing I would just say about wildlife tourism like that is that Ranthambore is an interesting case, I think, because it is one of the places that people have tended to go to, and actually the number of tigers has actually increased many times in Ranthambore, and it's actually to a large extent seen by the fact that the attention that is brought by tourists into what's going on in these areas, helps improve the whole conservation effort, I think, as well.
It does, and as you'll know better than I do, it's the income that then gives employment to local people that means they are less enticed to get income when they're desperate from poaching. And they can see that tigers are not a threat to them, because sometimes with wildlife, as you'll know, it's a problem of elephants in particular, but tigers and lions too,
Hmm.
where they need more space. If they are growing in numbers, they start encroaching on local human communities, and that then breeds antagonism from the communities, and you then get into a battle between the species for survival. So if you have successful safari parks with foreign tourists paying good money to come and keep them, you actually create an economic basis for an alternative future for those people.
Yeah. And in fact, certainly in India, one of the interesting things is that the local tourist revenues are probably now outstripping the international,
Interesting.
which again is, I think, a good thing.
That's not yet happened in Africa,
No,
I'm afraid.
no,
It's still, safari park visitors in Africa are overwhelmingly white from Europe and the US.
yes, and to some extent that probably is a source of resentment on things. I think both India and Africa can learn from each other as how these things have developed. I think India was rather loath to go around the tourism route at all. In fact, at one point in probably, I don't know, not long after you were there, perhaps, that tourism was actually banned for a while completely. That somebody had managed to get the High Court to declare that the kind of inviolate nature of national park meant that no one was allowed into it, which was basically stopped tourism completely for about a year. But it's now come back, and they're gradually, I think, seeing that what's happened in Africa, where like the Krugers, but at least double the size that it used to be, as the actual national park itself. It's been great to have you on this podcast. So thank you so much for being my guest on Books and Stories. The Rhino Conspiracy, I should just say, is out on the 10th of September. It's published by Muswell Press. And also, I think, Peter, you're on a panel dealing with issues raised in the book hosted by Save the Rhino on the 3rd of September.
I am, and Richard, thank you. It's been a great privilege to talk to you personally with your own experience and passion about wildlife, but also to take part in this show. But yes, Save the Rhino have been very keen to make sure that their cause, which I passionately believe in, the charity Save the Rhino, great campaigning organization, has got together to stage an event on the 3rd of September to interview me and have their supporters engage in the whole debate that I hope that I can bring to a much wider audience beyond wildlife enthusiasts to understand what is going on in our world at the moment to wildlife and on what I'm afraid are the killing fields of Africa as the species of especially elephant and rhino, but others as well, are threatened by this rapacious, obscene determination of human beings to just indulge in their own personal nefarious practices at the expense of the species of our lives and the planet ultimately.
So details of that event are actually, I think, on their website, which is www.savetherhino, that's all one word, .org. And we'll also put links on with the podcast information. So again, thank you for being such a great guest. It's such fascinating and important subjects. And also, thank you for listening to Belle Books and Stories. The studio production here was by Wilfredo Acosta. I'm Richard Dijkstra. I should also just say there are lots of interesting other podcasts in the series that Kay has been talking to Stuart Cosgrove about his new book, Cassius X. And I've been talking with George Logan, photographer who's been working with Born Free on a forthcoming collaboration about lines. It's a book called Lines, Pride Before the Fall. And also Kay was talking to Kate Sinclair about how books end up going on the screen. She's talking in particular about the discovery of the book that became Slumdog Millionaire. So I hope you've enjoyed this listening, and please join me next time. In the meantime, bye for now.